Welcome to Live at Kigali. This session is called Data for Development. I'm joined by Hoda Al Khzaimi, from Assistant Professor and Director of the Center for Cybersecurity at NYU Abu Dhabi. She's also the Director of Emerstack and the Co-Chair for the Global Future Council in the World Economic Forum. And I'm joined by Baratang Miya, who is the CEO of Girlhype and Women Who Code, as well as the Women Tech Policy Hub. So thank you for joining us. This year, the Kigali Global Dialogue is an official G20 outreach event, and that's a new development. And one of the key priorities for India's presidency of the G20 is how we leverage data for development objectives. And so, I think as data, we can be sure that data has transformed all aspects of our lives, right? But how can we sort of manage the both the opportunities and the risks that those pose? And so one of the key risks of sort of leveraging and engaging with the data-rich society that we live in today, how can we best kind of manage the issue of potential data literacy coupled with a lack of data regulation and advanced kind of regulations to deal with the rapid changes in digital technologies today? So I'm going to turn that question to you, Hoda.
Thank you, Terry, for bringing this up to the platform. And I think both of them lead to each other. It's the lack of proper digital stack that supports data, or digital infrastructure that supports data framework development is what we're dealing with. The ramification of not addressing proper regulation that comes for data on different utilization platform is very important, because data that you use for financial sector, for example, is totally different than data that you use for agriculture or data that you use for development purposes in general. And it's very important to create a general foundation for data regulation, and at the same time customize these regulations to the driving necessity gap analysis, or gap restructuring when it comes to addressing the missing points. Let's take, for example, the example of emerging technologies. We have countries around the world that have a solid data strategy and data sovereignty and data governance when it comes to dealing with AI analytics, like China, for example, being one of the major global producer of the technology. They have a very solid non-analytical data usability on different platforms, while other countries lack this kind of fast forwarding approach and making sure that they address the data gaps that might exist with emerging technology. This would leave them vulnerable when this technology will be rolled out into the market. And we have to be careful of the inconsistencies of powers that data sovereignty is imposing in the new societies and communities around us.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the other key things that we've been talking a lot about at this dialogue and in recent months is how the rapid change in data and use of data is changing the ways in which people can make a living. And it's changing work, it's changing workplaces, it's changing the types of work people can do, and it's having a lot of opportunities for creating new sources and new ways of generating income, but it's also, again, creating a lot of challenges and risks to equity, I would say. Baratang, you work with women entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. Tell me, what are the key trends, key issues, key challenges that you see with data and how it relates to livelihoods and women's work?
I think in many African developing countries, especially, Africa has those countries that are more advanced, like South Africa. And then you have countries that are still lacking a lot in resources. So there's lack of reliable data that can improve the lives of the people on the ground, like you talked about the data stack. And that misinform policy decisions, especially because literacy, as you said, of technology and the participation of women is still very, very behind. I think according to ITU, only 10% of African women are participating properly on the internet. So there's infrastructure that needs to be implemented. There's DPIs that needs to be dealt with. We need to have women's voices on the internet before we can start saying the data. And if you go to emerging technologies, the information that's there is still very misogynistic because of the people that have access to internet, which is male, and it's still driven from the data is still driven from the government side because people are participating, but they're participating not at relevant level. And for me, there should be a lot of initiative that seeks to address the gap that exists on the relevant data, and governments should do something to make sure that, especially you ask about women entrepreneurs, it's a very big word. Women come in different forms. In Africa, most of the women have been classified as informal traders, but they are really the foundation and the economic foundation in Africa who are really supporting families even though they are informal. So I think that is something that we need to look at when we start talking about the word entrepreneur. Are we talking about high-end impactful entrepreneurs, or are we talking about bringing women into the economy and making sure that the health sector, health is a big issue for women in Africa. And that is where data should be collected properly towards every woman, one woman at a time. Even if they're in the rural areas, we need to be doing that.
Yeah, you make an important point, right? Because it is that, I mean, women drive almost all economies, right? And women's work tends to be informal or informalized. And I wonder to what extent our transition to digital lives can help to formalize in some ways or identify women who are already contributing massively economically. I think one of the things is that, work is a source of income, but it's also often the way in which women access, or people in general access, social protections, right, through formalized work. And women tend to be missing from that space because their work is disproportionately informalized. And so they not only lack the same access to economic opportunities, but also to the social protections and benefits that come with that. And so in what ways can we use data to identify women and their work, and how can we use digital technologies to actually sort of formalize in some way the economic contributions and their economic activities? So I want to ask both of you, if you were to advise your governments on 3 key things that they should be doing to leverage data for development, what would your key priorities be? Hoda, I'll turn to you first.
I think one of the most important aspects of working with data is definitely understanding how we can activate their role in introducing new economies or creating active economies. So my first advice would be prioritizing democratizing data and democratizing data access to make sure that we can build technologies that are infectious when it comes to access to internet, access to banking, access to finance, access to all types of services, education, for example, healthcare. And how can data be used for that? So the first aspect is how can we build policies and strategies that are concurrent to the purpose of democratizing data. The second aspect as well is how can we create the body of work and ecosystem of the toolkits that should be available out there free of charge for the general public in the forms of DPIs or non-DPIs as well. That would empower usability of data. And I would advocate for crowdsourced kind of platforms, open source platforms that could be used at large by scientists, researchers, academics, or industrialists and governments across board to bring value out of this data for global good. And the third pillar, which is I think very important, because after democratization and after having open access to data, is how we can support data development for economic growth. And this goes for, advocating for embracing new innovations that would allow for monetizing data, for example, or allow users to own their data, not the big corporates, not the big governments, but for users to control access to data, to have selectivity of what type of data could be used by whom, and having that kind of granular control over their data privacy, and that kind of granular control of the monetary value that exists behind their data, and create the subsidiary digital economies that comes out of these kind of data monetization efforts and initiatives.
Yeah. I mean, it is one of the key kind of issues that data is owned by a handful of big tech companies, and they exploit the data for their own interests and their own profit, and it's not being leveraged adequately for, people are not benefiting from their own data, but also all of that information is not being leveraged for development objectives in which it could be. Baratang, I want to ask you the same question. If you were to advise your government, what would your key 3 priorities be for best leveraging data for development objectives?
For me, I would say that especially my government, is that decisions are made based on data, globally, internationally, and to change people's lives, especially women's life. We need to really be making sure that we get proper developmental data, and it's inclusive, it's diversified, it's got the voices of everyone involved. We cannot change the lives of women and girls in Africa if they don't have access to open data. There is a lot of research that can be done if access is opened and people have access to it and they can use it to benefit those who live in the continent. And the 3 key areas for me that stands out, because I work with women a lot, is health data, and economical data, to make sure that women participate economically, and to make sure that at the moment we're sitting at investment going into women's business as 2%. And we are only looking at it from a best view of PwC's research indicators. But if you do look at the whole holistic issue of what is it that women are contributing in Africa, that data needs to be collected, and then we can improve their businesses, their lives, and make sure that we help them, we make technology change their lives in their spaces, not move them into spaces that they really don't want to be in. And then the last one would be environmental data. As a South African, I think one of the challenges that we face now is seeing KZN being wiped off by rain, or whatever you call it, storms. And that's something I've never experienced. I mean, I've lived in South Africa half of my life, or most of my life, but it's one of those things that we've never experienced, and I don't think the government was ready for it. We need environmental data, and how is it going to impact Africa? Who's going to be impacted, and how? So that we prepare ourselves for these challenges that are going to be brought by climate change, and to make sure that gender-based violence in Africa goes down a little bit. That would be my highest recommendation.
Excellent. Hoda, I think you had another comment.
And I think the most important part is dealing with the issue of data and access, making sure that accessibility to data, data collection, data analytics is available on the go for users on the ground, not just for elitist decision makers or elitist institutions, and giving that data power back to the users to make sure that they have informed decisions and they can be part of the contributors to the economic development at large.
Absolutely. I mean, data can transform decision-making and our development processes, but as you said, we need to democratize that process, right? Governments need data. Internationally, we need data from other governments, and also communities and individuals need access to data to contribute to those conversations that are going to shape all of our futures. I want to thank both of you and to thank our audience for joining us today.